into the country worth over 1.3 trillion rand. Jack Ma says the training center will unlock young people's potential.
You look at, for instance, the lack of infrastructure in Africa, and you see great opportunity. And so do we. We see great opportunity in our continent, and Africa indeed is a land of hope. It is a land of hope. It is not only a land where there's a future. In fact, as the former Secretary General of the UN was saying, the next century really belongs to Africa for a whole number of reasons. It belongs to Africa because of the demographic dividend that we have, the young people that we have on the African continent is our dividend. And they are going to define the future. And I can tell you without any doubt whatsoever that they are innovative, they are creative, they are futuristic, they look at the future, and they are also brave. They are courageous, they are not afraid of anything. But the other thing is that they are also passionate, maybe as passionate as you are, and all they ever need is to be given the opportunity. And we see coming here to Alibaba as coming to a place that can unlock the opportunities.
Mr. President, you discuss a lot with me about you want to help the young people, small business, and you want to improve the economy there. And you want us to work with you on the training centers in South Africa. We've been thinking about that and preparing that. And you invited me to be South Africa again in October. And I keep that date. And we will discuss. I think today there are so many ministers here and guests here. Maybe we get some ideas. In October when I come to Africa, South Africa, we can discuss something in detail.
Now, nearly all of Africa's heads of state have been in China's capital, Beijing, this week for the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, the FOCAC Summit. China has described this mega event as a win-win situation, saying that cooperation will benefit all countries concerned. Now, President Xi Jinping pledged $60 billion to African nations at Monday's opening of the summit, and this against a view that China has taken to help Africa develop, not pile up debt. Well, helping us unpack this week's China-Africa gathering and what it all means is co-director at the Confucious Centre at the University of Johannesburg, David Monyae. Thanks very much for joining us. Welcome to the programme.
Good evening.
All right, so nearly all of Africa's leaders flew all the way to China. What does that tell us about this relationship that China has been able to develop with the continent?
This is one of the most unique relationship between a continent and one country in the world history. It has grown so fast that since 2000 it has gone in areas that no any other country or region has reached that level at political, economic as well as social. It has its own challenges, problems in a number of areas. However, it is organized through such a forum in which head of states sit down, discuss issues, and iron out and have a clear 5-year plan, and pledges are made. And the challenges are mainly in terms of what Africans want. I think that's the biggest challenge in my own view. At the African Union level, as you are aware, we have 55 African countries. And you have one country that negotiates with 55 countries. African countries are very fragmented. They vary in terms of size and power, negotiating power in particular. And therefore, what is negotiated through the AU is not what is implemented at sub-regional and sovereign state level. So those are some of the challenge. However, I think when it comes to assistance, loans favorable to Africa, China is doing much far better than traditional loan givers.
So, you know, China in the past has been accused of just wanting our minerals and even sort of agricultural land. Do you think that they've moved beyond that now, and that there's, when they talk about cooperation, that there is a genuine attempt by China to raise the game, as it were? Because at the moment, you know, we're importing finished goods from China and we're exporting raw materials to China, and trade is skewed in one direction, really.
I think this was one particular matter that President Ramaphosa, as the co-chair, raised quite squarely to Chinese counterparts. I think they've had the challenge that Africa cannot continue having this huge gap in terms of trade imbalance. But having said that, we also have to be quite clear. The challenge is here on the African continent. We don't beneficiate our own raw material, and I don't think we should blame Chinese for that. This is our own African challenge. We need to really work hard, upskill our people in terms of doing some of these tasks. We cannot rely on Chinese to build our infrastructure forever or service some of this infrastructure. And therefore, I think there is a need to ensure that these deals somehow in the long run, Africans will pick up and build their own, or be able to service this massive infrastructure that has changed trade on the African continent for the better. If you go to East Africa, I think you'll see the Nairobi, Mombasa rail. I think Djibouti, Ethiopia, in Nigeria, the Belt rail. It's visible. There's massive change. China has been able to do something that our own former colonial masters haven't done and are unable to do. They're preoccupied with issues of security, AFRICOM in terms of the United States, and there's no developmental approach from the West.
All right, so 60 billion has been pledged by President Xi Jinping, and that's on top of what he committed in 2015. And the question must be, what's in it for China?
China has a bigger plan that is far much bigger than what we see as Africans. China has a global grand plan. And that plan is around the issue of one belt, one road.
Right. And
that Africa is part to that. And China is changing the global trade. To some extent, it will be in its favor. As you know, the current trade, it favors Western countries, the global centers of capital in London and Washington. I think in next 10, 20 years, I think Beijing will be a major global trade should the One Belt, One Road succeed. And there's no doubt that it will succeed. And therefore, for China is to ensure that it grows the global buyers of its own goods. It has support from the African countries within United Nations and Security Council, within other multilateral forums. It ensures that it also has access to raw material, as we say, and far beyond that, have good relationship with Africa on issues of knowledge production and key other areas, security, through the African Union.
China has spent quite a bit of time and effort to say that, look, we are not Big Brother, we don't impose ourselves on anybody, and we don't interfere in the affairs of countries on the continent. But we do have this strange thing where African countries have to comply with China's issues. Taipei, for example, we've seen Eswatini didn't go to China because of their allies, Taiwan, and that Burkina Faso in May cut ties with Taipei over China. So is this a question of, look, we are friends, but we've got to do it our way?
China has non-negotiable issues. I think for most African countries, through the AU, there is a clear understanding that since the revolution in 1949, China was divided by Western countries. China was humiliated like Africa for more than a century in terms of wars, and China suffered a great deal, and it worked closely with African countries. In Bandung 1955 conference, China, alongside other developing countries, united around issues of anti-colonialism, anti-racism, and fairness in the global order. So it is within that understanding of which Africans understand there's only one China. And the developed country, including the United States, abide by that rule. And I don't see smaller African countries without power try to violate that one China rule. So it is within China's leadership and Chinese people that certain territories belong to China. And that issue is not disputed by anyone.
We've run out of time, but very briefly, if you can, China calls this a win-win situation. When President Ramaphosa comes back, can he say that, yeah, we got some good gains out of our trip to China?
There's absolutely no doubt that there's massive gains. However, the challenge is inward, whether here in South Africa or the rest of the African continent. African leaders, African people are not doing much in terms of improving their own well-being, and this being tightening the regulatory framework to ensure that the rule of law regulates Chinese businesses on the African continent. So I think issues should be within Africa itself and ensure that the Agenda 2063 is advanced. And therefore, I think there's so much work that is needed by African leaders, African scholars, to ensure that there's so much understanding and advance Africa's interests when negotiating with the Chinese.
David Monyae, always a pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much indeed for sharing your insights with us today.
Thank you.
All right, so that was David Monyae talking to us about this forum on China-Africa cooperation, which has come to an end. African heads of state gathered in their numbers in China in this win-win relationship that China says it has with the continent, and it looks like lots of gains for us. Now,